Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. We are proud at Leeds Beckett University to be an affiliate partner of the Institute of Contemporary Arts here in London. We'd like to thank Astrid Corporal and her team here at the ICA for hosting tonight's talk for our visiting guest professor, Craig Dworkin. I'd also like to thank the College of Humanities at Craig's own university, the University of Utah, for sponsoring his visit. And one more thank you is to thank the Lawrence Stern Trust, who have accommodated Professor Dworkin as poet in residence at Shandy Hall, Coxwold, the place where Lawrence Stern, of course, wrote The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. Some see it as the first experimental novel. During his stay here in the UK. Okay, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent now. Before 2001, when Martin Creed won the Turner Prize and had become a household name, he used to send his works through the post to Sir Nicholas Sirota, director of the Tate Gallery. In 1995, he made work number 88, a sheet of A4 paper crumpled into a ball. I'm always quite surprised that I can't do this very well. I have very low craft skills. But I have been told by Sam Belafonte, who works for Martin, that he was actually using American letterhead, which is a little bit squarer, so maybe that's why I'm struggling. Okay, this he then packaged and sent to Sirota at the Tate. Of course, it never reached Nicholas Sirota, as it was intercepted by a vigilant PA, who amusingly uncrumpled it, flattened it out very carefully, and popped it back in an envelope and sent it back to Martin Creed through the post. In doing so, the personal assistant fulfilled the promise of another Martin Creed work, number 141, From None, Take One, Add One, Make None. In 2008, I was lying in bed with my wife, and she rolled over and said to me, "You know, we've just remortgaged our house to build an extension on the side. We've got all this money in the bank account. We never have any money in our bank account. Why don't we spend a little bit of it on something fun each?" Naturally, I thought this was a fantastic idea. She bought the first iPhone at the time, and I purchased Martin Creed's scrumpled up ball of paper. I was the 540th customer, in case you're wondering. You get a little certificate as well in this nice little nest. Several nights later, my wife rolled over in bed again and said to me, "You know, you really wasted your money. That crumpled up ball of paper is no better than Marcel Duchamp's fountain." My retort, "You couldn't have paid his work a higher compliment." Why am I talking about crumpled up pieces of paper? Because our honoured guest speaker tonight, leading American art critic and poet, Professor Craig Dworkin, spends considerable amounts of his time examining the scientific ingredients that make up a single sheet of A4 paper, which appears in a series of works he calls facts. He has a fascination with engaging with works that would seem to ask only that they're not read. He likes to think about what Marcel Duchamp terms the infrathin, that point at which one can just barely begin to perceive a threshold between two states. The concept, Duchamp insisted, could not be directly defined, but could be elaborated through examples, the moment between the report of a gun and the appearance of a bullet hole, the temperature change in a seat that's just been vacated, the volumetric difference between the air displaced by a clean shirt and the same shirt after it has been worn, the noise made by corduroy pants rubbing together when one moves, the impression formed between two sides of a thin sheet of paper. Something to be studied. Something to be studied indeed, and this is exactly what Dworkin has done. These highly intelligent precision readings might afford us ways in which to think about how we can analyse the existing works of others, because if Dworkin can show us how to find meaning in the most seemingly resistant works, then he may just be providing us with a means to learn to read differently. A renowned scholar for his groundbreaking books, Reading the Illegible, from Northwestern University Press, and No Medium, from the MIT Press, we are delighted he has taken time out from his busy teaching schedule at the University of Utah to be with us here tonight. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor Craig Dworkin.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Astrid. Thanks to everyone here at the ICA for setting everything up. The often visionary writer and always very literary filmmaker Jean Cocteau features a book in the opening scene of his film Orphée. It's set amid the bustle of the Café des Poètes, where Orpheus is shown a copy of the journal containing these the poems of his new rival. It's the enfant terrible, Jacques Segeste. And Orpheus glances at the cover. It has that thin borders, very elegant Didot typeface. It mimics the familiar designs of Les Éditions de Manouy. And he flips through it and objects that the book is entirely blank. And his companion, this older writer, explains that it's titled Nudism, and Orpheus tosses the book back with a snicker and says, "That's absurd. C'est ridicule." And in part, this is the dismissal that is typical of the response of an establishment put upon by avant-garde pranksters unwilling to assimilate the gestures or ces gestes of radical reduction. But he also in some ways gets the joke, right? The jest, say, of the pretensions of this absurd book. And ces gestes, the homophone of that author's name, Jacques Segeste, the lettré tells us can also denote ridiculous pretensions. Mais c'est ridicule. And to be fair, getting the joke is that nudism does follow the structure of a gag, right? It's structured like the cheap one-liner of a New Yorker cartoon or something like that, where it moves, unexpectedly from, and with the false naivete of the joke between the verbal code of its title and then the visual code of the pages of its interior. So at only a glance, I think certainly the whole thing would seem like a hoax, but the specifics, and this is really part of what I want to argue today, the specifics are going to be telling. It's instructive, I think, to pause a little longer than Orpheus does before he tosses aside this issue. And the difference between the sophistication of getting the joke and then a greater sophistication of refusing to get the joke depends on how closely one actually tries to read a work that seems to ask only, as Simon said, that it not be read or only that it not be readable at all. So to begin with, blank books are actually typically not really blank. They have text on them somewhere in order to construct and frame their blankness, in order to establish their bookness. And in Cocteau's case, those interior pages are indeed, they're entirely blank. There are no page numbers, no headers. But the review's cover title, Nudism, frames any interpretation of the blank sheets that follow, and that is the joke itself. And since several different titles conceivably could have given rise to the same cheap punchline, I want to reflect just a little bit on what the journal was not called. So it was not called Silence. It was not called Silence, for instance. And indeed, at exactly the same moment that Cocteau is filming Orphée, John Cage delivers his famous lecture on nothing at the Artists Club in New York, where he declares, "I have nothing to say, and I am saying it, because what we require is silence, but what silence requires is that I go on talking." And Orpheus's companion, not coincidentally, is respected for maintaining these decades of principled poetic silence because he has nothing more to say. Je n'apporte rien de neuf, he explains, underscoring his contrast with Segeste, with Jacques Segeste, that author of nudism who has nothing to say and in nudism is in fact saying it, which for Cage defined not just silence, but actually poetry itself. I have nothing to say and I am saying it, and that is poetry, he continues in that famous lecture. So, while it would have, suited the same intellectual moment that's voiced by Cage, the title Silence would have maybe come too close to the very first book, famously published by Manouy Jean Laurier's Silence de la Mer, the Silence of the Sea. The review is not titled with a Sartrean néant, even though Being and Nothingness had been published in 1943, which again might have brought the satirical mise en scène of the Café des Poètes too close to Cocteau's actual target, which was Sartre's real-life haunt in the Café de Flore. He did not choose Rien, which maybe would have signaled a Dadaist nihilism, or maybe a refined fin de siècle aestheticism. This from Mallarmé's Coup de Dé. It's not titled manque or lack, that term that Jacques Lacan would develop as a terme de métier in just a few years' time. It's not titled with the mystical Buddhist vacuité, any number of related words, vide, absence, lacune. Any of these titles presumably, right, would have elicited that same exasperated response from Orpheus, but their differences inflect the very impatient dismissal that he gives the book, and I think start to point beyond it. So nudism, that is, already wittily anticipates Orpheus's very response in a way that these other terms would not. So to denounce the publication as a hoax while seated in the café among the true believers in the Café des Poètes is in essence, right, to proclaim that the emperor has no clothes. So this nakedness that the book itself is already openly confessing. The collection presents itself, I think, just as Orpheus accuses it as being the naked truth, but it also presents itself, to borrow Jacques Derrida's phrase, as truth as nakedness. So Orpheus unclothes a nakedness, but it's one that's already announced its intention of disclosure even before the book is opened. It's simultaneously unapparent and fully exhibited nudity. And by doing so, nudism literalizes the metaphoric. It not only covers its pages, but it takes off the metaphoric bed sheets that show the actual sheets of paper underneath. And it also enacts then this dumbly presented way that truth itself gets figured. There's a version of Derrida's demonstration that the figure of nakedness is not just any metaphor, but the very metaphor of metaphoricity itself. So in staging the joke, nudism offers up the very figuration that its pages would seem to refuse. That is, even as it eschews verse, the genre that traditionally turns most conspicuously on figural language, it figures figural language itself. The book figures the figure of metaphoric unveiling. And at the same time, this title, nudism, triggers mechanisms of social and moral reflex in that best avant-garde tradition of wanting to piss off the bourgeois. So it's this title that performs a quick double punch of first eliciting the shock of a prudish bourgeois reader by announcing the salacious subject, and then denies the prurient and equally bourgeois expectation of some kind of titillating content within. in fact, I want to underscore that it's a title that does not advertise what would merely be a classically sanctioned nudity or even a general nakedness, but the specific nudity of a sort of countercultural nudism. And by 1950, this word nudism carried connotations of lubriciousness from which some of the time we're attempting to distance from the word naturism, naturist. And you can track, you actually track the frequency of these words over print media at the time. Naturist is gaining ground relative to nudist at precisely the moment that Orpheus is being filmed. The French Naturist Association was founded in 1948. The attendant lifestyle magazine, La Vie au Soleil, begins publication the following year, and they're presenting this term naturism to emphasize connotations of communal living, holistic health, vegetarianism, environmentalism, in contrast to the increasingly pornographic exhibitionist associations that nudism carried. And so in doing so, they're etching those associations all the more vividly, so that this punning rebus that Orpheus acknowledges works at the level of abstraction, certainly between sign systems, between word and image, but any particular sign occurring within those abstract systems, silence, nothingness, absence, etc., any particular is always going to be historicizable. That's the point I want to make. And then further, I want to argue that in contrast to those other plausible titles, that nudism implies an unveiling more than a simple negation. I think that we might think about what has been made naked in or made naked by Segest's publication. So part of the work's frisson is the remove at which it pitches its rhetoric of clothing and the removal of that clothing, which is to say, again, a rhetoric of rhetoricity itself. So to conceive of a dematerialized idea that is clothed and somehow made more tangible by language, elides the degree to which our sense of language is itself usually dematerialized in relation to the physical materiality of print, of ink on paper, that would make that language manifest. So that print clothes clothing. It clothes a clothing. Now, given the title, Orpheus might have expected even a plain-spoken or unartificed poetry, something like the style of an unornamented genus humile or genus tenue, as classical rhetoric would have it, but suggests to strip away not just some specific kind of rhetoric, but any legible language at all. So in this work, what's been laid bare, what has been mise en nu, is the page itself, the physical facture of this noise-making, weighty, extended object, the substrate of print, what was at the time the typical technological support for poetry at mid-century, which is to say that by the 1950s, it was the space of the page, that was indifferently ready to take the imprint of really almost any kind of text, treating almost any kind of topic. And this is the fate of poetry over the 20th century, really, from, you get the most intimate, bodily, confessional, free verse details to the most banal, everyday, minor epiphany lyrics. Poetry becomes this really capacious genre that would treat any sort of subject with any kind of form, any kind of politics, any poetic style, from the sort of most excessive or most reductive avant-garde gestures and hoaxes to the most retrograde Alexandrins. So if if nudism is provocative, though not quite in the way that licentious readers hope, it's also, and with a similar disappointment and excitement, with those entirely unprinted pages, it is quite promiscuous. It is obscene in Jean Baudrillard's sense of the term. It's explicit, or as they might have said in the 50s, it is easy, which would be explicitus in the classical Latin. And this is a forgery of. And we might talk about its failures later. But I want to emphasize the similarities and differences between this notebook, which was made as a kind of novelty gift for literati or film buffs in the know, and the book that served as the prop in Cocteau's film. So nudism in the film must have about 40 blank pages. It's a material that had to, there's a sort of obvious but not incidental trace to its trim and its structure. The pages are thin enough, they're supple enough to pass through a press without damaging the type. They're pliant enough to be sewn. They've also been trimmed to accommodate what would have framed a standard lyric verse with sufficiently luxurious, aestheticized margins. The book in the film, that is, takes the textual form of a sort of self-satisfied individualism. It's light enough that can be carried under the arm. It can be taken en plein air. It's light enough to be handed easily back and forth without moving more than an arm, without upsetting a glass of wine on the cafe table. It can be tossed lightly aside, be slipped into a stack of paperbacks, all of which the actors in this scene perform. So as the film thematizes, the blank book nudism is portable. It's scaled to an individual reader. It's a format that permits a very precise form of communication, small enough that it can be carried in public without being, an ostentatious burden. But at the same time, it's actually large enough, as you can see here, to require a certain care. It needs a certain spread. It needs the support of an elbow, the support of other books while reading. And you can contrast that with the sketchbook on someone's knee in the same shot here. So even though it's suited to a single private reader and to the space of the outdoor cafe table, when it's open, it is also public. It announces itself as being read. It's harder to slip under the table, like that notebook in the background. So the review, in short, is the perfect object for the space in which it's distributed and consumed, and where it plays this defining role in the social network of the cafe. It connects these discrete generations of writer, the young Orpheus, the older poet figure. It distinguishes between insiders and outsiders. Like Orpheus, it reinforces the homogeneous community of fashionable young habitués. It recalls the economic patronage of a princess who funds its publication, but who is not from there and cannot pass among them. And above all, it advertises the success of this cafe mascot celebrity, Jacques Segeste. And I want to suggest here that this is one of the primary lessons of media themselves, that we're misled when we think of media as merely being objects rather than as social events, that the closer one looks at the materiality of a work, the closer one looks at the materiality of exactly the kind of paper you have in front of you, the fact of its physical composition, its facture, that the more the social context is brought sharply into focus. Now, historically, just a quick sketch, right? The word mediums denoted number of related but mutually reinforcing, probably by now inextricable ideas. So following from the Latin adjective medius, something that's just in the middle, medium takes on sense of instrumental intermediary from about the late 16th century onward. So when you can track this general sense, through the dictionary, which records its role in designating really pretty much three kinds of transmitters. There's first a sort of broad class of modes, but yet is not of necessity that cogitations be expressed by the medium of words, is in opposition to gestural. Sign language is one of the earliest examples from Francis Bacon has it. Second medium starts to denote conduits between things. Thomas Peck talks about a reflective looking glass, this mirror that becomes the medium to let you see a wonder, or much later, the marine seal's whiskers give it its sense of touch. They are the medium, quote, through the sense of touch is gained, quote, through the medium of his whiskers. In the 19th century, you then get predominantly the spiritualist sense of medium, as well as a sense of liquid surround. The atmosphere of ether or water or air becomes the medium of transmission. And then third, you get venues. One 18th century reader comments to a journal on the useful information expected from, quote, the medium of your curious publication. There's a late 20th century financial report that notes that, quote, foreigners could deal anonymously in British markets via the medium of a Swiss bank. And that sense of venue then expands to denote what used to be called mass communication, whether as a mode, television or radio, or as an institution. We talk about it with an article in front as the media. And all of these senses then come together in what might be a synonym for genre or discipline, quote, any of the various varieties of painting or drawing as determined by the material or technique used. From there, the word comes to denote the materials or the techniques themselves, and eventually moves beyond the bureaucratic departments of fine art academies to signify, quote, any material that is physical, such as tape, disc, paper, etc., used for recording or reproducing data, images, or sound, and more recently, of course, to denote some kind of electronic device that we think of as new media still. And I want to run through this because I think intuitively this all makes sense, but that a book like Nudism puts enough pressure on the term to open up some fissures in those tidy reinforcing surfaces, and reveals that idea of medium to be far less stable than we usually think about it. And I'm not interested in policing the word's usage in any way, but I want to call attention to some of the assumptions that are behind the word medium and that attend the way we use it. So to begin with, just to ask whether media look forward in time or backwards in time for their definition. That is, does the determining factor reside in their prior inscription or in their inscriptability? Now, so to ask this question concretely, is typing paper already a medium before it gets inked? Right. I mean, any object, it seems, could be inscribed on in some way by some object. And so the mere potential for inscription seems to expand that notion of medium in a way that makes it not at all meaningful or useful. But for some prior inscription to be the defining factor of media then raises these other questions. If the paper, for instance, is one of the media used for, quote, recording or reproducing my notes here, is it still a medium in nudism where nothing has been recorded yet or reproduced? And if not, then we're left with the situation in which the material specifics of the paper are integral to the meaning of the work, but where the specific material, right, those sheets of paper, is not the work's medium. And if, on the contrary, then we recognize the blank sheet of paper as a medium, if we define media on the basis of its inscriptability, we're then faced with the question of how to know when mere materials have become identifiable media, right? If it hasn't yet been inscribed, how do we know that it's actually inscribable? So the certain sense of media, I think, is caught between, it is in the middle, medius, of these impossible chronologies, which would bring us back to that primary lessons of this predicament. So first, one can never locate a medium in isolation. Media are only recognizable as collectives. So inscription obviously requires some sort of material impingement, but the act of reading, despite being so often figured as disembodied, also always involves a material interaction. To know if a compact disc has been used for recording or reproducing music, for example, it needs to be played. To actually hear the music, moreover, requires not just a player, but requires speakers. The medium of the music, and in the sense of its material format, can't be just that disc alone, has to comprise the networks, the apparatuses, the inscriptive relays that are going to move all the way from lasers, padding, casings, wires, to the electrical grid itself. And it's hard to know then where that would stop. A phonograph disc and the PVC pipes, in the wall here have, essentially the same material, where they're molecularly identical, but they're rather distinguished by the sorts of things that they can be hooked into. Whether you can put a stylus to them or whether you can put a valve to them seems to be what determines their mediality. And then the second lesson, again, I think that media mislead us when we think of them as being objects, because they're only legible as media under certain circumstances. That's only when their specificity seems to matter. So if you're asked to contemplate a blank CD, here at the ICA in some exhibition of non-cochlear sound art, that's one thing. If you go to the office supply store and are handed a blank CD by the clerk, that's something else. Again, even though those objects are exactly the same. Or to take an example just a few aisles over, a wrapped ream of typing paper means one thing when it's stacked in the store. It means another thing when it's stacked in an art gallery vitrine. It means yet another thing when it's on the shelf in the poetry section of a bookstore, and so on. And those, you can think about those who would balk at buying a blank sheaf of paper as a book of poetry, be happy to walk into the office supply store and buy that very same sheaf of paper to use in their copier. And that gives us a really concrete example of such a work in the late 1960s in New York's Second Avenue coffee house, Le Métro, standing in for Cocteau's Café des Poètes, and where Leda Hornick simultaneously played, I think, both the Princess and Orpheus to Aram Saroyan's Segeste. And Hornick had been publishing under the Culture, this Culture with the K, the Culture imprint, promoting this Lower East Side aesthetic from an Upper East Side address with a series of new American poetry titles, including Poems Now. There's an anthology edited by Hetty Jones, Screen Tests / a diary. It's a collection of, quote, poems plus film strips by Gerard Malanga and Andy Warhol. This is Warhol's portrait of Leda Hornick. And then Bean Spasms, a collaboration between Ted Berrigan and Ron Padgett. And those publications were then followed by this 500-page book bearing only a price tag, $2, and a copyright notice stamped across the cover, copyright Aram Saroyan, 1968, Culture Press. Or to be more precise, those stamped lines were the only text added to the factory-supplied wrapper, which also does read at one end, Stationer Seal of Satisfaction, 500 sheets, 8.5 by 11, sub 16 gur long. Saroyan had already been the author of several books, including one from Random House, but referred to this Culture Press publication as, quote, my first real book of work. And despite that avowal, and the genuinely unconventional list of publications that culture had already established, even Hornick remained unconvinced. And so like Segest's patron, she financed the publication with a really pretty extravagant generosity, but then also like Orpheus, she bitterly dismissed the whole enterprise. And many years later, Hornick recounts her predicament with I think a still... Well, you'll hear the still vivid spite, but I think also an admirably candid sense of her own paranoia. She writes, I published a ream of blank typing paper by Aram Saroyan, the son of William Saroyan. I didn't really want to do it, but I had a commitment to Aram. I thought he was trying to sabotage my newly successful book publishing venture by forcing me to back out of my commitment and telling everyone that I'd gone back on my word because I was too bourgeois to understand Dada. Rising to the challenge, I went ahead and published the wretched little thing. My distributor wouldn't touch it. I sold 12 copies myself, and after saving 2 copies for history, I threw the rest out in the garbage. I didn't even bother to save the paper for typing. Now, in 1968, ream of typing paper costs about $1. And so if you consider the advance that she pays to Saroyan, Hornick accordingly lost about $1,500 on this book. That's around $10,000 today, so around 7,000 pounds, if you adjust it for inflation. This is Alex. Oh, there it is. There's the wrapper. Actually, I'm going to skip that part. So she has this potlatch, really to trump the Dada gesture that she perceives in Saroyan's submission, and in doing so, she ensures, essentially that the most of the paper from the project is going to remain, as she was, entirely unimpressed, not even printed on, not even typed on. But with that dépense, with that extravagant gesture of destruction, she also, I think, acknowledges the force of Saroyan's project, which was not just the idea of a blank book, or the idea of blank pages, but a very particular kind of paper that was not to be used as intended, right? She wasn't going to use it for typing. So Saroyan's book might be without substance in the sense of, literary subject matter, but it does indeed have substance in the sense of the stationer's terme de métier, which you can see right there, the weight measure of the sheets. In this case, it's... as the label says, it's substance, sub 16. It's a 16-pound manufacturer's ream, or 4 pounds when it's trimmed to the long grain business bond letter size chosen for the Culture Press publication. And in fact, although any given sheet from Saroyan's book might look nearly identical to any page from Nudism, the details, as always, as I want to claim, demonstrate how equally unmarked pages nevertheless enact distinctly different significations. So unlike Segest's conventionally bound codex, Saroyan's loose-leaf book takes the form associated with pre-publication, right, with the weight and trim that's actually unsuited to commercial printing techniques, but is optimized for typewriting. The Culture Press publication presents paper as if it were coming to the writer, not as it comes from the binder. It's a kind of literary future tense. This is the physical format of the book to be. As William Saroyan, Aram's father, wrote, God, how I loved paper, and still do. What a delight it is to open a whole big ream of clean white typing paper and to behold the stack. Why, though, why do I love paper? Why is it a delight to open a wrapped ream? Well, seeing all that unused paper permits me to believe that I can fill every sheet with writing, and not only with writing, but with the kind of writing that only I can do. Now, this is written some years after Aram had already presented his father with this wrapped ream as a finished literary work. So this passage not only speaks to the symbolic status of the ream of typing paper, but also betrays this really smug tone of counter-Oedipal contest. he's insisting with glee on removing the wrapper, which is, the one thing that could distinguish his son's publication from any ordinary ream of typing paper, and then reasserting, right, that unique authority by shifting the terms of value really firmly back to literary style, right? Unlike my son, who cannot fill any sheet with writing, the passage seems to imply, I can fill every sheet with writing. And what's more, where anyone might have put, their name on a package of typing paper, my use of that paper would be something that only I can do. Now, I want to suggest that Aram Saroyan's work actually anticipates both of those charges and displaces the very grounds of personal style with a work that would, in fact, not be the same, even if it were signed by some other poet. But for the moment, maybe just recall that typewriting for William Saroyan, for his father, had long been both the means and the subject of the literary work. In the short story Myself Upon the Earth, for example, William Saroyan writes, "Day after day, I had this longing for my typewriter," period. That is the whole story. And already by, there's his typewriter, already by the 1930s, the image was a cliche. Quote, William Saroyan sits at his typewriter and writes about sitting at his typewriter without anything to say. So decades later, his son's book, even more resolutely, has nothing to say, but by not saying anything beyond an assertion of copyright, it boasts that Aram Saroyan can be an author without even typing. It is like renders moot Truman Capote's famous legendary Parthian shot at Jack Kerouac's On the Road. It isn't writing at all, it's typing. But the Culture Press book, seems to require a rejoinder to further remove. It isn't even typing at all, it's just publishing. And I have nothing to say, and I am typing it, and that is poetry. It might be Cage's response. There's Saroyan Pear typing Kerouac's typewriter. And I think by invoking the specter of typing, the format of Saroyan's book not only underscores, its affront to the expressive output of previous modernist generation. You think of, Papa Hemingway typing at his typewriter, but it also firmly places that publication within a series of poetry books in which Saroyan had already sent up that heroic mythos of the modernist typewriter with the wry understatement by replacing their macho athleticism. I can fill every sheet with this stoner minimalism of just one-word poems. And yet for all of their sort of whimsical irony, I think none of Saroyan's minimalist books, including that ultimate reductio of the minimalism of the blank page, quite registers merely as a joke or as the repudiation that Hornick took his culture book to be. And the critiques, in fact, the wager something that is bought actually at the cost of insisting on literary value rather than negating it. And that moreover, as scenes in this kind of sorry family drama between William and Aram Saroyan, each of those early books asserts Aram Saroyan's own right to be identified with a typewriter, however long the shadow cast by his celebrity father. So, while one might expect a mimeographed small press publication such as his 1967 book, Coffee, to be printed entirely from typed stencils, both of Saroyan's commercially published Random House books also reproduce typewriter typefaces, even though they're printed offset. So, moreover, with their otherwise undecorated covers starkly emphasizing the kind of bold exaggeration of an there's a photo enlarged typewriter typeface that's used to set those titles. all three of his books, published one after another in quick succession, distinctively branded Soroyan's poetry publications with the look of an enlarged typewriter typeface. And accordingly, in his correspondence with Hornick about the production of the Culture Press book, as they were working out what form it was going to take, he wrote, "I'd like to use this typewriter face in red on the spine, blown up to about twice its size here." So the typewriter face, not just a signature look, but as he claims, it was responsible for the fine points of his signature minimalist style itself. And his statement on the back cover of the book Pages, here expounds, "I write on a typewriter, almost never by hand, and the typeface is a standard pica. If it were another style, I'd write subtly different poems." An even bigger influence, he says on his poetry in the same statement, and this recalls Henry James and other writers who had preferences for very particular brands of typewriters because of their sound or their mechanism. He says an influence on his poetry is the machine itself, quote, "an obsolete red top royal portable." And this seemingly, extraneous aside, I think then further corroborates the association of that Culture Press publication with typewriting, and more directly to Soroyan's other poetry books. Originally, he recalls that the Culture Press book would have matched the color of his typewriter, standing in for the inspiring machine itself, which had been rendered unnecessary in a blank, untyped book. He says, quote, "My initial idea for the book was that it should be entirely wordlessly red, a red cover, red back cover, red end papers, and all the pages, and with a copyright notation, the only printed content." And although it couldn't have been, read in any conventional sense, as one might say one has read a book, it would have guaranteed that it had literally been read always cover to cover. As it was in fact published, recall, the book still retains a trace of that red in the manufacturer's label, but the wrapped loose leaves can't even be examined, right, to see if they are red or if they're unprinted, if anything's on them, without destroying that cover. And here I think we can start to see the logic behind the copyright symbol that's stamped on that paper wrapper. If it can't be read in any conventional sense, word by word, page by page, Soroyan's book can still be read, it can be understood as a book, as a cultural object, according to the material specifics of its format. Had Hornick produced the title as a conventional codex, even with blank pages, like Nudism, like those other books published by her press, it would have lost the punning countersignature that this version, in fact, has, because the standard commercial packaging of typing paper, as William Soroyan says, is a ream, which is just a tidy paragram one letter away from arum. And that same punning proximity to the proper name recurs just a year later in the Charles Eliot Norton lectures delivered by the designer Charles Eames, right after the publication of Soroyan's book, where he unavoidably evokes the name of his collaborator and his wife, Ray Eames, when he effuses about reams of paper, commercially packaged paper, sort of touchingly declares, is, quote, "absolutely beautiful stuff. Whatever you do with a ream of paper can never come up to what the paper offers in itself." So to do something with the blank paper of Soroyan's ream, one would have to remove that wrapper. And that wrapper is the one thing that makes it a book, rather than just a stack of packaged office supplies. So its status as a book ensures that the nonpareil beauty that Eames identifies with the sheer material stuff offered by the paper itself is the very thing that cannot be determined. So by presenting what the paper offers in itself, though, right? A monochrome 4-pound block. Soroyan brought the book into dialogue with the design aesthetic and the artistic concerns of his precise moment. This prefabricated unit of standardized geometric mass, the uniformly wrapped format of the book, situates it further from, something like Bean Spasms or any of the other poetry books of his moment, and much closer to something like the dull, white, rectangular units of Carl Andre's 1966 equivalent, 1:8, these neat, variously permutated arrangements of unmortared calcium silicate fire bricks, direct from a construction supply plant. So insisting on that blunt physical presence rather than disappearing as the transparent conveyor of some sort of linguistic message, the ream, unprinted and wrapped, rhymes with these various modular geometric solids that minimalist sculptures were proliferating throughout the 1960s. And furthermore, I think by using this ready-made consumer object with the label still attached, Soroyan enters his work into direct dialogue with some of the most instantly recognizable sculptures from the period. In 1964, Andy Warhol had featured the rectangular blocks of consumer packaging right in his exhibition of Brillo boxes at the Stable Gallery in New York. And by 1968, the time of his first European retrospective, they dominated the entrance to the Moderna Musik in Stockholm because the simulated grocery boxes had already become, in Arthur Danto's assessment, Warhol's most iconic work. So with the colorful swirls, they're not so colorful in that photo, but the colorful swirls of James Harvey's design, I think the Warhol's boxes make this campy commentary on all the other more austere cubes and rectangles that had been stacking up in galleries under the sign of minimalism, right? If you really want clean surfaces, these boxes seem to insinuate here are 24 giant size packages of scouring soap pads to get the job done. But clean and fresh, as we heard in both Eames and William Soroyan's assessment, are also terms that are idiomatically associated with blank typing paper. And although he doesn't mention his Culture Press book in this context, Soroyan's retrospective assessment of his books of minimalist poetry from the period negotiate these twin poles of minimalist sculpture and Warholian pop art. What I was doing in writing a one-word poem during the 60s has long seemed to me to be the equivalent. Remember Carl Andre's brick sculptures titled Equivalence there. Has long seemed to me to be the equivalent in language to the work of Andy Warhol in painting, his instant, simultaneous, and multiple images of Marilyn Monroe, and Donald Judd in sculpture, his instant, simultaneous, and multiple metal boxes. So like the move from envisioning a book set in a typewriter typeface to imagining a book that is the color of the typewriter itself, Soroyan's contextualization here corroborates the ream status as, I think, logical, legitimate extension of his writing practice rather than the Dadaist break from poetry that Hornick feared, and more importantly, that Soroyan's historical emphasis there, writing a one-word poem during the 60s, underscores a point that, however obvious, is worth reiterating, that the same object signifies differently in different cultural moments, that a ream of paper in 1959 or in 1979 alters into a cultural milieu in which Warhol's boxes had not yet made their statement, or one in which they'd already had their say, just as a poetry book of blank pages today would enter into a world in which poetic blanks have long had their say, but have been repeatedly forgotten. All right, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Craig. We have time for some questions, and we have a roving mic, so if you could just put up your hand if you have a question.
It's the audience version of a blank sheet of paper, which is I really like.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about what you thought the literary genealogy of this work is, because it kind of seems to me that it has this sort of wry, dry, witty, postmodern almost feel to it. But at the same time, particularly in American context, it's doing something similar to what Pound and the modernists were doing in terms of stripping back poetry to its most kind of elemental, fundamental building blocks. But obviously those are quite kind of diverse and have quite opposed aims. So I don't know if that you can maybe resolve some of that confusion.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. I mean, I would think of it as in some ways picking up on something that's implicit even in Poundian aesthetics, where very early on, if you think of Ezra Pound has a poem, it's a 3-word poem, spring, ... too long, ... gongula, ... which, he gets from reading an archaeological magazine, and it's a translation of just a corner of a fragment of papyrus. The poem's titled Papyrus, of a newly discovered Sappho poem. I think that, so it's rhyming in part with Pound's sense of himself as a historian and going back and rescuing little snippets of culture. Also speaks, though, to that modernist aesthetic of disjunction and fragmentation. But I think the lesson he learns from it, you get also in the cantos right after he's making an allusion to Eliot and the poem he collaborates on by editing with Eliot, the fragments that he's shored against his ruin, and you get again this translation of a bit of a torn letter from Malatesta. This is early in the cantos when he's opened, sort of as a historian, he's opened Malatesta's mailbag, and he's transcribing what's just part of the address in Florence to Count Malatesta. But the part of what Pound is recognizing there, and that maybe is getting picked up on again in a too literal way, is paper itself, is the substrate itself, what survives from papyrus over the centuries, that the part of what made the paper from Malatesta be part of an epistolary correspondence was that it could be folded and it could be torn open, that it could be addressed on one side and written on another side. So in some ways I want to say he's actually picking up on one element of that modernist poetry and really amplifying it. But that's not getting at the contradiction part either. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hi, thank you, first of all. My question is because I think what is interesting about that particular moment in time that the lecture talked about, the 60s, was in which the transparency of language, and therefore language as promoting an exchange of information, could be resisted by the emphasis on the objecthood of whatever supported it. And I wonder how you feel about that today, because I feel like today there is a sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but a sort of impossibility of objecthood as it would come back then, in which an object before its own production is already integrated into this fluid, non-object sort of information ideology. I don't know,
Well, no, actually, impossible because it's already part of a more fluid system, or impossible for.
Well, yeah, impossible because it's already part of this fluid system, but also the resistance, because of that, the resistance it could provide becomes impossible as well, as strongly as it was back then.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, this I think is just in general would be the lesson from different historical moments, and it's probably how you actually know that you have different historical moments. Is that my guess is that the equivalent function to that ream of paper is not going to be something that looks like a ream of paper. So yeah, I think we're probably at a place where that would be impossible, which is, I mean, sort of the point I wanted to end on, that it's always going to be historicizable in a way that makes it not able to operate, makes the object not able to operate with the same function as it would have 10 years earlier or 10 years later. That we lose that the equivalent of, in the same way that in the same way that the equivalent of a book of poetry 100 years earlier wouldn't have been actually a book of poetry at all. It would have functioned in some other way. I think you're right. I think that's exactly right. I mean, do you have I think you have a different sense of the impossibility, though, maybe.
Not really. I mean, it's something that I feel pressing in my own work, which is there is a drive towards some sort of negation, but then how to go through with this drive once the possibilities to embody this negation are anti-negation, and then it sort of annuls itself. And
yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things, at least in a literary context, one of the things that has changed and makes that more difficult is that the social relationships articulated by that ream of paper are much less stark than they probably were in the 60s. Whereas, Soroyan couldn't have ordered a ream of paper to be delivered by, an Amazon drone without ever talking to another person. That's the delivery of that object to someone who would type it up more neatly and be paid to do that. Or a spouse who would type it up more neatly, and then the sending of that document to someone who would mock it up for printing. The desktop publishing has changed that in a way that makes the stage at which something would be resistant, or the stage at which something would stop in a signifying network. I think is much more fluid and confused. I mean, that would be one, minor way for this object. I think that's a really good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Objections? Yeah.
Hi.
There.
I can't help but notice that all your examples are male, and I wondered about the idea of wrapping the empty space from Jeanette's perspective of the paratext as perhaps being an accessory to the body, and I wondered about the idea of having the liberty to wrap the empty space, and if you had any kind of equivalent examples that were perhaps from a female perspective that you could draw on or talk about, maybe.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is interesting about the paratextual part of this is that it's somehow, it's not quite like collapsing exterior and interior, but it. I think there's a dialectic, or there's a dynamic between what would be paratext and what would be literary substance here, in which as I say, the wrapper is the one thing that distinguish this paratextual title and copyright, which would normally be external to the work. If we don't think about it too much, is in fact the only thing that constitutes the work that then is not there when you get there. But once you've gotten there, you've taken off the wrapper, and then it's too late and you've spoiled it. I don't know how closely I want to follow I don't know how closely I want to collapse the sort of metaphoric body of the work with actual bodies. But I do, as I tried to emphasize, I do think that there's a distinctly critical response from Aram Saroyan to a macho masculinist modernist sense of what it meant to be a writer, which was to pound stuff out on the typewriter. So I think that is a specifically gendered response to that. I don't know. Do you want to say more about where that freedom or lack of freedom to wrap space comes from? I like that phrase a lot.
No.
Oh.
It just came to me. I think that conversations around this idea very often draw on a male perspective, and from my own perspective of research, which is perhaps historical bibliography, gender very much comes into ideas of the paratext when it comes to the prefatory and the wrapping of authorship, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that, I don't know enough about this historically to go very far with this, but it would seem to me that actually the typewriter itself would be, sort of great archaeological tool to look at. It doesn't take very long, but it's fairly stark transitions between the gender of the operators associated with the machine. And again, I think, and this goes back to questions of the discrete stages between production, so that in the late, the turn of the century, the very late 19th century and early 20th century, you would have had typists who were only male. They're then quickly replaced by typists who are largely female, and typewriter then, a word that doesn't distinguish well between the machine and the operator of the machine. I now want to find out what this is. How it is that figures like, these sort of macho figures like William Saroyan and Hemingway, in the 30s, wrested the typewriter away from women office workers, and then, as I say, like at what stages a ream of typed paper from a conventional author are sent to someone who is or isn't likely to be gendered in some way. I don't know. It seems like the perfect way to explore that question, but I don't know enough historically to get the nuance.
No, I don't either. But I think maybe more perhaps I was wondering if you had any examples of this same, of women working around the same time in a similar way that you could draw on as a point of comparison.
No, I don't know enough people at all doing, blank works. The, the facsimile of nudism that I showed briefly, is a collaboration between a husband and wife team. No, I don't have other examples. If I had other examples from anyone, I would have put them in. Thank you. This is a really good question. Yeah.
Hi. I was just interested in what you mentioned about transparency and about this sort of insistence on the physicality of the medium rather than it's a transparent transmitter of data, and whether there's ever really such a clear distinction between those two things, or whether the physicality of the medium is always going to be some sort of distraction, and whether there's something to be explored in this conflict between perceiving something as a physical object and reading it as data. And maybe something in that instant that, going back to the introduction, something about that sort of infra-thin moment, and maybe we've kind of got closer to that perhaps with digital media, because we don't have crumpled physical pages, or we don't have sort of record scratches, but there's always going to be some sort of like conflict going on in that instant of perception.
No, that's really nicely put. I think that's exactly right, that it's, rather than something being transparent or opaque, I think of them as hinged moments in which, any transparency, and any seeming transparency, is just giving way onto something that could itself become transparent to some further opacity. That if you take you take off the print and you've just got the paper, but there's something behind that paper as well. And I think you get you certainly get the same sense with with new media, with digital media, in which what you seem like you're looking at something, but it's only being rendered by a language behind that, which is only rendered by a code behind that, which is only rendered by what seems to be digital, but even the digital signal processing in the computer is interpreting modulations of analog voltage that are coming out of places. Yeah, I think you're not getting to one or the other, but what you see, and I think this is one way to think about media. Would be media. We distinguish between media when we have to switch the kind of reading that we do. You can think of a long, continuous chain of things, and the point at which you have to use a different code or a different language to make something sensible or legible. That's the point when you can mark off one media from another. I think that's exactly right.
A couple of years back here, there was an exhibition which was examining the curator's role, right, in an art exhibition. And I found it fascinating because there was a designated path round this exhibition. And it showed a variety of shapes of pictures, some very big, some very small, until the very smallest picture had the most huge curator's explanation by the side, right? So you were looking at this tiny picture with the explanation, and then the final installation was a beautiful gold frame in which the curator's opinions were dominant. And your talk has made me wonder, what role did the art have in it, or did it just go away? The border.
A beautiful frame with nothing inside it.
Well, no, it had all the curator's writing.
Inside the frame.
The curator's
nice.
writing had become the artwork.
Right.
And I kept thinking, in a Beckettian world, where did the art go?
Right. Well, I mean, this was it's sort of one of the I think one of the. It's too schematic, to be really true. But the one way to think about what happens as content, seeming content is evacuated, pictorial content is evacuated, and you get monochromes, you get blank sheets of paper. That there's a lot more talk, and this gets us to paratext or paragon. There's a lot more talk around it. So if you the more language you evacuate from the book of poetry, the more language accrues around it. People like me. Where the art has gone out of that'd be a question about what art is. I'm certainly not qualified to talk about.
Is it blank? Has it suddenly gone blank? I'm very interested in
Yeah, well, what I like so much about this is to think about, and this would go back to what it would mean to restage this gesture with different objects. Would be, could you? This would be the ultimate. This is so good. This is a perfect place to end on. What would be the ultimate, really blank work? Would be one that had no commentary around it. Could you silence even clever critics and art historians? Right? Not can you evacuate stuff not can you make a monochrome canvas, but can you silence the discourse of art around it? I think that'd be a great challenge.
Maybe we need to use other senses. Maybe the paper would smell.
Paper always smells, yeah. Yeah, it attracts molds and bacteria and things. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.